Sauron, the evil entity that wants to dominate the continent of Middle-earth. In the story of The Lord of the Rings itself, I always think of him as a so-to-say construct. That is also not a bad thing. He's a story element with a specific function. He has no character development potential. We and the characters in Lord of the Rings don't learn too much about him during the story, nor do they really interact with him directly. There are pretty much no dialogues with him. All we know is he is evil, lives in Mordor, and tries to conquer Middle-earth for millennia. People in, for example, Gondor fear him and see his influence mainly through constant orc attacks and threats from the east. Sauron himself seems to be such an unimaginable evil entity for the people in Middle-earth that they don't dare to use his language, black speech, or avoid speaking too much about him. For the story, he is a constant threat, powerful, but on a way invisible, like a veil of darkness that hangs over Middle-earth constantly. But at the same time, he is the main motivation, the main conflict, because he is the Lord of the Rings. But who actually is Sauron? What's his story? Sauron is no human or elf. He is an Ainu, a so-to-say spirit being, and he is of lesser rank. As explained in almost all my other lore videos, there are certain high entities in Lord of the Rings. The highest is the transcendent god creator Eru Ilúvatar. His servants are the Ainur, and we know two main groups of Ainur. Valar, they are like high-ranked angels or a god pantheon, and Maiar, they are like angels of lower rank and are the helpers of the Valar. A prominent example for a Maiar would be Gandalf or Saruman, who took the form of old men. Sauron also belongs to the group of Maiar. He was once named Mairon and a servant of the Valar Aule, so to say the god of forging and crafting. Under the group of Valar there was one that was not only extremely powerful but also very rebellious. It is said that he was the strongest of the Valar, Melkor, or as he is later called, Morgoth, meaning the Dark Tyrant. He desired to create sentient beings like Eru could and searched the void for the so-called secret fire or the flame imperishable, which was Eru's ability of creation. He never found it. His ways and ideas were different from the other Valar, and he was a strong dissonance to the harmony of the others, which is reflected in the story about the music of the Ainur. You can read about it in the Silmarillion. He was also the brother of Manwë, who was the leader of the Valar. By the way, Gandalf references the secret fire on the bridge in Moria against the Balrog. Gandalf is a servant of the Valar and Eru, who wields the secret fire, while in contrast the Balrog, the flame of Udun, is a fallen Maiar serving Melkor. Udun was one of Morgoth's strongholds and, so to say, his residence. Back to Sauron. Melkor ensnared Mairon, and so he became his apprentice, and known as Sauron, which some would translate with the Abhorred. Another name for him is Gorthaur, meaning terrible dread. He should become one of Morgoth's highest and most important servants, second in command together with the Balrog Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs. Melkor gave him his second fortress Angband while he was residing in Utumno, or as it is called in Sindarin, Udun, as mentioned before. Also note that I skip a few things here and start at the end of the so-called War for the Sake of the Elves. The Valar fought long and hard in this war against Melkor and managed to beat him. The Valar Tulkas, who is the god of war so to say, managed to cast Melkor down and put him into chains, to be precise. They conquered and searched both of his fortresses, but Sauron was not found, and Melkor should be pardoned by Manwë 3 ages later. This was, by the way, before Sun and Moon was created and before men awoke on Arda. Well, even though Melkor begged for mercy and was pardoned, he was actually not that sorry and already planned his revenge, so he started to negatively influence the Noldor elves and later went to Avathar and visited the ancient spirit being in spider form, Ungoliant, so to say the mother of Shelob. What Ungoliant actually is hard to say. maybe an entity of the void, some kind of Maiar, or just a mystery like Tom Bombadil, Goldberry, her mother the River Woman, and the nameless things. Melkor and the starving Ungoliant, who wove webs of shadow around them, went to Valinor, the realm of the Valar on the continent Aman. There, Melkor stabbed the 2 giant trees of Valinor, and Ungoliant drank all their blood, and the wells of Varda surrounding the trees dry, which let her grow in size and power. The 2 trees of Valinor were the light source of the world back in the day, besides the stars, so it was pretty dark after they got destroyed, helping them to escape. Sun and Moon were later created out of their last fruit and flower. Celebrimbor, who was the elf making, for example, the 3 elven rings of power and some others, had a famous grandfather named Feanor. Feanor was the greatest elven smith who has ever lived, and his masterpiece were 3 beautiful jewels who had the light of those 2 trees in them, and got blessed by the Valar Varda. They were called the Silmaril, and even the Valar desired them. You can say they are probably one of the most powerful artifacts ever made. You can imagine how special these powerful jewels must be for the elves, Maiar and Valar, because they are all what is left of their beloved 2 trees' light. I mention this because it's to some degree important, even for the Lord of the Rings. For example, the phial that Galadriel gave to Frodo as a gift had the light of the Star of Eärendil in it, which is in fact one of the Silmaril, and with that a reflection of the light of those 2 trees. That maybe also explains why it blinds Shelob, who is the daughter of Ungoliant, just much less powerful. There is another legend about Melkor destroying 2 giant lamps that were the light source of the world, at least how it was originally intended, and existed before the trees. He has a history when it comes to destroying light, but that's a story for another video. So after destroying the trees, he went to Feanor's fortress Forminos, killed his father Finwë, and stole the 3 Silmaril from there. Ungoliant and Melkor escaped over Helcaraxe to Middle-earth. That is so to say a pass of ice that connected the continents Middle-earth and Aman. When they arrived there, Ungoliant wanted the Silmaril from Melkor so she can devour the jewels, but he refused because he desired them. So he got woven into webs and nearly devoured himself, but his scream alarmed his Balrogs, who came and rescued him, driving Ungoliant away. With this, Melkor was in possession of the 3 Silmaril, and Feanor cursed him, naming him Morgoth, which, as mentioned, translates to Black Foe or Dark Tyrant. He and his sons also made an oath to retrieve the Silmaril at any price, and convinced his fellow Noldor elves to sail with him back to Middle-earth and help him. This becomes important a bit later. Celebrimbor, who was most likely born much later, did not take part in this. The oath of Feanor led to terrible deeds by him and his sons, for example 3 kinslayings where they even murder other elves to reach their goals, which turned the oath into some kind of curse. Those elves definitely abandoned reason for madness, but this is a story for another video. I will say this quite often in this video because the backstory here is quite complex. Speaking of complex, now things become complicated because we have to look at Beleriand. Beleriand was a western part of Middle-earth. It was destroyed and sunk into the ocean after the War of Res. We come later to this. The First Age and the time in Beleriand is full of wars and stories that are connected with each other. Even though the First Age was quite short, many things happen there, and often it is not 100% clear what is canon and what not. So it's really hard to summarize it, and I have to be a bit imprecise and skip through a few things. This part is also one reason why this video took me so long. To understand Sauron and the events around him, we have to look at his master Morgoth. So this is a very long explanation to how Sauron is involved into all of this and how he became what we later know. So, back in Middle-earth, Morgoth rebuilt his fortress and found out that some elves remained in Middle-earth, for example in Beleriand. Why the elves did this is another long story for another video. But it's also a bit important, so here's the imprecise short version of it. The first elves created awoke in East Middle-earth at a bay called Cuiviénen, a bit prior to the war for sake of the elves. This was during the years of the tree, so before even the First Age. It happened that Melkor found the elves first and influenced them. Later the Valar Orome visited them too and found out about the bad influence. When after the war the evil Valar was bound to the halls of Mandos for 3 ages, as mentioned before, the Valar decided to bring the elves over to Aman, so they are with them and safe from Melkor's and his servants' influence. But not all elves wanted to leave Middle-earth, and also they had to travel very far, the so-called Great Journey. So the elves split into 3 groups, mainly the Vanyar, Noldor and Teleri, and those groups sometimes split even further. The Vanyar probably made it completely to Aman, same with the Noldor, but the Teleri only partially. However, the Teleri lord Thingol, also known as Elwë, met the Maya Melian and fell in love with her. Both vanished for 200 years, and when they returned, they founded the kingdom of Doriath or Eglador in Beleriand, with those remaining Teleri who did not sail to Aman yet and waited and searched for their lord. Those elves that waited became known as Eglath, the Forsaken. Thingol became their king, and they would be known as the Sindar, Grey Elves. Also, Melian used her Maya powers to protect the kingdom, and formed an enchanted fence, the so-called Girdle of Melian. Nobody less powerful than Melian could pass it against her will. The elven language Sindarin also has its origin here. This was before the awakening of men. They woke at the beginning of the First Age far in the east and came to Beleriand a bit later too. Also, in the other video mentioned Luthien is the daughter of Thingol and the Maya Melian. Luthien and her husband Beren, Barahir's son, are ancestors of Aragorn and Elrond, but of course Beren was born hundreds of years later. Some of those names, especially Luthien and Beren, will return later. Now we skip a few events, like the death of Feanor or several wars of the elves in Beleriand against Morgoth, a 400-year-long siege of Angband by the elves and Fingolfin, and finally go back to Sauron. He might have helped during all those wars, but there are no notes about it. After Fingolfin's death, he is a brother of Galadriel's father in a 1v1 duel against Morgoth himself. Several hundred years later, during the First Age, Sauron is mentioned again. Morgoth, who wanted to make moves against the elves again, gave Sauron the task to conquer an island named Tol Sirion. On this island there was a tower that was also named Minas Tirith and was built by Galadriel's brother Finrod to guard the pass of Sirion and protect Beleriand from Morgoth forces. So it was strategically important for Morgoth to get this place. Sauron was successful, and the island became known as Tolin Gauroth, the island of werewolves, where he also bred those. Also, Morgoth heard about the deeds of a man named Barahir, the father of the mentioned Beren, and saw a threat in him, so he gave Sauron the task to kill him. Barahir, for example, fought in the Dagor Bragolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, where the mentioned Fingolfin died in the end, and Morgoth ended the elven siege of a stronghold after 400 years. During this battle, Finrod, Galadriel's brother, got surrounded and was in a lot of trouble, but Barahir took some of his bravest men and came to rescue Finrod under great losses. Finrod was very thankful and swore an oath to Barahir of friendship and help for him and his kin in all situations. He also gave him a ring as a token of his gratitude, and you guessed right. That's the Ring of Barahir, the ring Aragorn is wearing 6,000 years later. A lot of oaths are working during the First Age, the oath of Feanor, this one, and one that we will hear about later. Morgoth started to expand in Beleriand, but Barahir and his men tried to fight against it and help in Dorthonion, but they often had to hide and were quite good at it. They were like a band of outlaws. It was only a small host of 12 companions. His son Beren and his 2 nephews were under them too. Also a man named Gorlim. He had a wife named Eillinel. When he returned to his house and farm, he found it plundered and forsaken, so he returned to Barahir. But his love was great and he had hope that she is still alive, so he would secretly visit his house from time to time looking for his wife. Morgoth's spies learned about this, and so one day he saw light in his house and it looked like his wife was there too, but it was a trap. And Sauron's hunters captured him. They tormented Gorlim the Unhappy, but he would not betray Barahir until Sauron promised him to set him and his wife free. Gorlim agreed and betrayed Barahir, but Sauron explained that his wife is long dead and what he saw was an illusion created through his sorcery, but that he would keep his promise, and so he killed Gorlim cruelly to set him free so he can find his wife in death. Now that Sauron knew about Barahir's location, he sent orcs to surprise the outlaws and kill them all. And so Barahir and his companions died, except for one. Barahir sent his son Beren away to spy upon the enemy, so he was not there when the orcs surprised them at dawn. They also took the hand of Barahir with the ring as a token for Sauron. When Beren was asleep, the race of Gorlim visited him in his dream. It was more like a vision. He saw carrion birds sitting thick as leaves upon bare trees beside a mere, and blood dripped from their beaks. Gorlim appeared and confessed his treachery, but also warned and bade him to hurry and save his father. Beren awoke and ran to his father's camp, but he was too late. His vision came true. He buried him and swore an oath of revenge. Beren pursued the orcs and sneaked into their camp. Their commander boasted of his deeds, holding up the hand of Barahir with a ring. Then Beren jumped on the captain from behind, slew him, took the hand of his father, and miraculously escaped. From now on he lived alone in the wild and ate no flesh and only killed if it was a servant of Morgoth. The stories of his deeds spread even to Doriath, and even orcs preferred to run on sight. Morgoth set a price on his head, as high as on the head of Fingon, High King of the Noldor elves. So Sauron was sent to hunt him down with an army, with werewolves and fell beasts. The land was corrupted by Sauron and Beren had to leave Dorthonion. He fled the most troublesome path imaginable, through Eret Gorgoros, that is around where Ungoliant's offspring is living. Eret Gorgoros also means Mountains of Terror, and that's for a reason. After that, he went through Nan Dungorthep, which means Valley of Dreadful Death, where Sauron's sorcery and Melian's power met. No man or elf would have ever dared to go there, but Beren did it and survived. He also didn't like talking about this horrible journey later on. He also went through the Girdle of Melian and entered Doriath unnoticed. But how is this possible? Melian has foretold that one day someone will pass through it, and it was Beren, because his fate or doom was greater than her power. In the forest of Doriath, Beren saw Luthien for the first time and fell in love with her, and later she with him. It's a longer story. I recommend reading it in the Silmarillion. Luthien took Beren before her father. Well, it was a bit more complicated than that, and he was first afraid, but then asked to marry Luthien. But Thingol was not a fan and even wanted to execute Beren. But Beren showed the ring of Barahir on his finger, and his speech impressed the wise Melian, so she asked her husband to calm down a bit. But still, he said something like, "You can marry my daughter when hell freezes." To be precise, he bound a task to it that he thought was impossible. He should go to Morgoth and retrieve one Silmaril from his crown to Thingol. Beren accepted, and so his quest for retrieving the Silmaril begins. The deal was also some kind of oath, and fates were bound to it. He traveled through dangerous places and nearly got killed, but made his way to his father's old friend Finrod in Nargothrond. Here many fates and the mentioned oath clashed. It's probably another story for another video, but in short, as mentioned, Fëanor and his sons swore an oath to retrieve the Silmaril, and they did many terrible things to do so, even murdering their own kin. So the oath became a curse. You could say the Silmaril are cursed. Finrod swore an oath to Barahir to help him and his kin, so he of course offered to help Beren on his quest, and Beren swore to retrieve a Silmaril. At this time, Finrod had two visitors, Curofin, Celebrimbor's father, and his brother Celegorm. Both are sons of Fëanor, and they really wanted to get the Silmaril. They were also family. All those parties argued, and the sons of Fëanor even convinced almost everyone in Nargothrond to not help Beren. Finrod, who was king, laid down his crown until he has fulfilled his oath. 10 of his most loyal men came with him. This story is a lot about fate, oath and curses, and you probably see now why the fate of Beren is greater than Milian's power, because the curse of the Silmaril and the fate of Doriath is bound to it. Beren, Finrod and his men disguised themselves as orcs with the help of Finrod's magic and tried to pass the mentioned Isle of Sirion, but were found and revealed by Sauron. Finrod fought Sauron but lost in the end. However, the latter could not find out who they were, and so he took them prisoner. Over time, he fed them one by one to his werewolves. But Finrod's men did not betray their king, until only Beren and Finrod were left. Luthien, having visions of Beren in need, tried to get out of Doriath to come to his aid. During this, she had her own adventures. For example, the minstrel of Doriath betrayed her, so she got caught there. But as a daughter of the Maiar Melian and King Thingol, she had magical powers. I would say she was one of the most powerful elves who have ever lived, on her own way. So she freed herself and later was found by Celegorm and Curofin, one of the most unlikable elves on Arda. They claimed to help her but took her prisoner, so they could use her to pressure King Thingol, and Celegorm wanted to marry her. They also had a special hound. Celegorm was, before the rebellion to retrieve the Silmaril by any price and going crazy, a friend of the Valar Orome, and he was gifted a giant hound named Huan. He was extremely intelligent and powerful. He was also able to speak but not allowed to. The giant hound of the Valar was not pleased how they betrayed Luthien, so he talked to her, helped her to get free and even allowed her to ride on him, so they escaped and went to rescue Beren. Meanwhile, Sauron decided to let Finrod live because he was probably a wise elf lord, valuable to his master, and decided to feed Beren to one of his werewolves. But the powerful Finrod bursted his bonds and killed the werewolf with his bare hands and teeth, getting mortally wounded in the process, but fulfilling his oath. He died in the tower he once built, now corrupted by Morgoth and Sauron. Beren grieved bitterly over the death of his friend. Luthien arrived soon after this and sang a song, which sounds weird, but a lot of magical power in Lord of the Rings is in words, like curses, oaths, but also songs and music. The world was created through the music of the Ainur, and it seems Luthien's music was extremely powerful. Indeed, before Finrod was captured, both he and Sauron battled with powerful songs, but Sauron's mastery was greater, and so he could take them prisoner. But now Luthien sang, and the tower known as Minas Tirith trembled under the power of it. Sauron sent his werewolves one by one, but he was not aware of Huan, who killed all of them. Finally, he sent Draugluin, so to say the father of all werewolves. He and Huan fought long, but Draugluin escaped to Sauron, telling his master that Huan is here before he died. Sauron now took himself the form of the greatest werewolf ever seen and attacked. Even Huan recoiled a bit, but Lúthien's power blinded and fatigued Sauron, and Huan could slowly overcome him. Finally, Huan caught Sauron by the throat. Lúthien offered Sauron to release him when he gives her the power over the tower, and Sauron agreed, transforming himself into a vampire, or a giant bat I guess, and flew away, while blood was dripping down to earth from his throat. And so Lúthien controlled the island, undoing the corruption of Sauron and releasing all prisoners. She found Beren still grieving over the body of Finrod. When the island was finally cleansed, they buried him there. This is the last appearance of Sauron in this story, and I can really recommend this part of the Silmarillion to read, but in short, in the end, after many adventures, Beren managed to fulfill his oath with the help of Lúthien and Huan, and brought one Silmaril from Morgoth's crown to Thingol, but died himself in the process. Same with Huan. Grieving over the loss, Lúthien died too, and she went to the halls of Mandoth and sang for the Valar Mandoth, the judge of the dead, which moved him to ask Manwë and Eru to help her. Eru allowed Lúthien to become mortal, and she was revived together with Beren to live one human life together in isolation. They had a son named Dior. After this, many events happened surrounding this Silmaril. The greed over it led to a lot of death and despair. For example, the second and third kinslaying of the elves, where the sons of Fëanor were involved, as before at the first kinslaying. In the end, Eärendil, who married Dior's daughter, got the Silmaril and wore it at his brow while sailing on his flying ship through the sky. So it could be seen as a star, which became known as the mentioned Star of Eärendil. Now we skip to the end of the First Age. It ends with a giant war after the fall of Gondolin, the hidden city of Turgon, the War of Wrath. Gandalf's sword Glamdring was probably Turgon's sword and made there, same with Orcrist and probably Sting. Here again Eärendil played an important role as he sailed over to Aman and asked the Valar for help, and they agreed and fought Morgoth there. During this war, Eärendil also slew Ancalagon, the biggest dragon who has ever lived. In the end, this war destroyed Beleriand and sunk it into the ocean. Morgoth was captured and banished into the void. Sauron, who also fought in this war, took a fair form again and surrendered to the Maiar Eonwë, who ordered him to go back to Valinor and receive judgment by Manwë. But instead of going back, he escaped and hid in Middle-earth. Before and during the events of the War of Wrath, many elven kings and lords died. In Gondolin, Turgon, second son of Fingolfin, died, and so Gil-galad became High King of the Noldor elves. After the destruction of Beleriand, the giant spider Shelob fled and reached a place called Mordor. She was there before Sauron, even though he later made use of her presence to guard Cirith Ungol. He did not control her. It is said that he calls her his cat. What happened to the other offspring of Ungoliant in the Ered Gorgoroth is not known. And now, finally, the Second Age begins. Sauron hid for probably 1000 years and resided in Mordor, starting to build Barad-dûr around the year Second Age 1000, growing his power and knowledge in secret. He was now alone and still the highest ranked servant of Morgoth, so he slowly became the new Dark Lord, but was still devoted to his master and continued until he would return. He also built temples for Morgoth. He was smart and careful, planning and executing his plans in secret. Sauron was a very different evil compared to Morgoth. Sauron, of course, still had a lot of orcs and trolls, and we later also know about wraiths, evil spirits, wargs, that's probably a related breed to the werewolves, and fell beasts, but he had no direct control over Morgoth's higher servants like Balrogs or dragons, even though he was no enemy to them. After some time he could have much easier influenced men, he decided to corrupt the elves and bring them under his will. And so he took a fair form and posed as Anatar, Lord of Gifts, an ambassador of the Valar. He tried to influence different elves like Gil-galad, but they refused. So he continued searching for elves accepting his help. In this disguise he went to the elven realm of Eregion and helped Curofin's son Celebrimbor and his guild or brotherhood of jewelsmiths, the Gwais y Myrdain, to create 16 rings of power, or probably more, to finally corrupt them with a master ring, the One Ring. At first, the elves believed him that he was sent by the Valar to aid them, foreshadowing the arrival of the 5 wizards, the Istari, in the Third Age, thousands of years later. Galadriel and Celeborn lived in Eregion too at this time. The couple survived the kinslaying and the fall of Doriath in the First Age, where Galadriel met Celeborn. Galadriel did not trust Anatar, but probably did not expect Sauron himself. I guess nobody did. However, we can read in the Unfinished Tales that Anatar managed to strengthen his influence over Celebrimbor and the guild, and over a long time made them revolt a little bit against the couple. So Galadriel left Eregion through Moria to Lothlorien, but Celeborn stayed there. During this time in Eregion, Anatar instructed and taught the elves the necessary knowledge to forge rings of power and was present at their creation, which corrupted those rings. But even the used knowledge had an evil intent behind it and was corrupted itself by Sauron. Nobody noticed this at the time. And with this, Celebrimbor and the guild forged a lot of rings, but the most well-known were the 16 rings of power. Eregion had a good friendship with the dwarves of Moria. For example, the magical gate of Moria, which we know from the Lord of the Rings, was created by Celebrimbor. With this said, there is the legend that he gifted one of the 7 rings of power to Moria's king Durin III at this time, but it's not clear how canon this is. After the creation of the 16 rings, Sauron left Eregion around 2nd Age 1500 to forge the One Ring. It seems this process has taken him a long time, since he completes it 2nd Age 1600. In secret, Celebrimbor forged 3 special rings of power on his own, without telling Anatar. These were the 3 elven rings of power: Vilya, the Ring of Air, Narya, the Ring of Fire, and Nenya, the Ring of Water. Sauron's first part of the plan worked, and the elves created and wore the Rings of Power. His final step was to corrupt them with the creation of the One Ring at Orodruin, which means Burning Mountain. It is also rarely called Amon Amarth, which translates to Mount Doom, the most common name for the reader, I guess, because it's linked to some prophecies. In some notes we can read that Mount Doom was once created by Morgoth himself. Also, when he forged the One Ring, Barad-dûr was completed after 600 years. To forge the One Ring, Sauron put a part of himself, his evil will and a lot of power into the ring, and from now on the One Ring was part of Sauron, and he was bound to it. It could not be undone or destroyed except in the fires of Mount Doom. It should become a curse for Middle-earth and led to Sauron's peak of power. When Sauron finished the One Ring, all elves using those rings of power were aware of his plan. The resistant elves were able to take the rings off their fingers and knew that Anatar was indeed Sauron. Celebrimbor also knew that at least his 3 secret rings of power must be brought to a safe place, so he traveled to Lothlorien to have counsel with Galadriel, and they both agreed that at least the 3 rings must be hidden and never used, because they had not the strength to destroy them. And so he gave Nenya to Galadriel, and Vilya, the most powerful ring, and Narya to Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor. An interesting side effect of, for example, Nenya, the Ring of Water, was that it strengthened the desire to leave Middle-earth in Galadriel. Sauron was very angry that the elves did not fall for his plan, formed a giant army and headed through Carlenardon, straight to Eregion's capital Ost-in-Edil. Note that from Sauron leaving Eregion to the sack of Eregion it took around 200 years. His forces were so powerful that Eregion did not stand a chance. He found the 9 rings. Celebrimbor was captured and tormented, but he only revealed the location of the 7 rings, but not the location of the 3 more powerful elven rings, and was put to death in Eregion. The body of Celebrimbor, shot by orc arrows, was put on a pole and carried like a banner by Sauron's forces. The High King Gil-galad sent Elrond to their aid, and he managed to merge together with Celeborn, who was still in Eregion, and I assume his men. The elves were almost defeated, but the dwarves of Moria also helped and attacked the rear of Sauron's forces, together with King Amroth's forces of the elves from LotR, so they could escape. This led Elrond to build a stronghold for his forces and the refugees from Eregion, that we now know as Rivendell or Imladris. The dwarves and Lothlorien elves were pushed back to Moria by Sauron's forces, and they pretty much closed the door behind them. Sauron now split a part of his army to hold Elrond in Rivendell and started to go west to conquer Lindon, where Gil-galad and 2 elven rings of power were. Sauron assumed that at least 1 ring could be there. He destroyed everything on his way. Gil-galad had good connections to the powerful kingdom of men Numenor, and so he asked them for help when the war started. I recommend my other video about Aragorn and Numenor. The Dark Lord started to lay siege on Lindon, and the elves were in great trouble, almost lost, but a delayed and powerful army of Numenor arrived over the sea and pushed Sauron's forces back. Numenor was smart and sent a part of their ships further to the south to catch Sauron while he was retreating, and they almost caught him, but he managed to escape with all his armies lost. After this war, not only Eregion, but big parts of Eriador were in ruin. Sauron was close to conquering Middle-earth, and even when his armies were destroyed, so were the lands of the elves and men. Keep in mind that Gondor and Arnor did not exist at this point, and Numenor slowly started to establish settlements at the western coast of Middle-earth. So even with this defeat, Sauron was still in a strong position, but because of the new Numenorian settlements in the west, he could at least not move there. Seeing this and vowing revenge against Numenor and the dwarves, Sauron decided to start corrupting them over the centuries, maybe when many had already forgotten and things became legends, just my theory. He started to corrupt the tribes in the Far East, and if you have watched my History of Rohan video, you will see how much trouble Easterlings would be in the future, and it often felt like Sauron had to do with it to some degree. He gifted the 16 or maybe 15 rings of power, 9 to some kings of men, sorcerers, warriors, black Numenorians, and 1 Easterling king. And 7 or 6 since Durin III probably got his ring directly from Celebrimbor to the dwarf lords. The dwarves proved to be immune against the corruption of the rings, but it increased their desire for treasure. However, men were easily dominated and corrupted, and it turned the 9 into Sauron's most powerful servants, giving them magical powers, but slowly transforming them into some kind of race. They became known as the Nazgul, the Ring Race. The most powerful of them was the Witch King of Angmar. Second in command was Khamul, the Easterling. The other names and identities are not known. As mentioned, Sauron was in a good spot, and with the One Ring he was powerful in Middle-earth. He called himself Lord of the Earth, or King of Men. This provoked the proud Numenorians on the island Numenor, but the smart Sauron probably knew about their strengths and had definitely an evil plan in mind to have revenge on them. As mentioned in the other video, Numenor must have sent one of the most powerful armies to Mordor that Middle-earth has ever seen. When Sauron saw the mighty host of Numenor, he just surrendered and let himself take prisoner, but of course with evil intent. It was his plan, and the Numenorians underestimated him. The powerful and cunning Sauron was brought to Numenor as a prisoner, but raised over the decades to advisor of King Ar-Pharazôn. He used the conflicts and fears of the mortal men of Numenor to bring them to the ultimate madness. Their fear of death and jealousy of the immortality of the elves played a big part. I explain this in more detail in the other video. In the end, people there were just insane, except for the faithful, who still hold to Eru, the Valar, and the elves, but had to flee from the island with Elendil, Isildur, and Anarion being the leaders of the faithful. Sauron was seen as a god by most of the Numenorians, with a giant Morgoth temple built, burning the white tree Nimlos in it, which was related to one of the two trees of Valinor, and was a gift of the elves to the men of Numenor as a token of their friendship, but Isildur saved a sapling, risking his life before it was chopped. Even human sacrifices for Morgoth were made in the temple. Also, King Ar-Pharazôn built the probably most powerful ship fleet ever seen and sailed to Aman to fight the Valar and claim immortality. While Sauron was laughing in the temple as he got his revenge, Eru himself destroyed the fleet of the king and buried them in the Caves of the Forgotten. The island of Numenor and all that was on it was destroyed too and sunk into the ocean. Not only this, even the world was reshaped and became a sphere, and the continent of Aman was lifted into the realm of the unseen, so no man could ever enter it again over the sea. Only the elves were able to travel there with their special elven ships on a strange path. Also, the body of Sauron was destroyed in this process, weakening him, and so from now on he was not able to ever take a fair form again. His spirit returned to Mordor, and he still had the One Ring, but as mentioned, Elendil and his two sons Isildur and Anarion made it to Middle-earth, where they founded the kingdoms of men. Elendil founded Arnor in the north, and Anarion and Isildur founded Gondor in the south, and reigned over it together from Osgiliath. Sauron of course attacked Gondor. He even took Minas Ithil and burned the White Tree again, but Isildur, anew, saved a sapling which was later planted in Minas Anor, which we now know as Minas Tirith. There were also conflicts with so-called Black Numenorians, who also settled in the region, but more to the south, before the downfall of Numenor, and were still corrupted by Sauron, because they were not from the group of faithful. They also didn't accept Isildur and Anarion as rightful kings. Under the great pressure of Sauron's forces, Gondor had a lot of trouble, so Elendil and Gil-galad forged the last alliance of elves and men, and this mighty host came to aid Gondor and destroy Sauron. Sauron was aware of this and tried to hold them off or delay them. For example, he desolated and burned down big forests that the host of the Last Alliance had to traverse. As mentioned in the other video, the Entwives left the Ents in Fangorn and moved further to the east to grow smaller things. So all these plain fields we know from the Third Age had once much nature and forests on them, but after Sauron desolated them, they became known as the Brownlands. However, his efforts had no success. The army of the Last Alliance, that also included dwarf armies, arrived and confronted Sauron's force at the Blackgate, merging with Gondorian forces. An interesting note here is that deeds and evil from the past manifested here to some degree and was originally created by Morgoth through his theft of the Silmaril. In the army of the elves was a special group of elves, the Sylvan elves, descendants of the Nandor elves that were related to the Teleri elves mentioned at the beginning of the video. You remember how Noldor elves under Feanor and his sons did terrible things like the 3 kinslayings? That was mainly against the Teleri. For example, in the first kinslaying, they killed the Teleri in Aman to steal their ships so they could sail over to Middle-earth and get the Silmaril back. But even within the Noldor elves, there were conflicts. Finarfin, Galadriel's father and Feanor's half-brother, learned about the kinslaying and was ashamed by the deeds of the others and stayed in Aman. Feanor's other half-brother, Fingolfin, and his friends had to walk to Middle-earth over the icy pass of Helcaraxe, where many died because Feanor burned the ships when he landed in Middle-earth instead of sending them back to fetch the others. Feanor was not really a nice guy. The second and third kinslaying was about Feanor's sons killing everyone in Doriath, getting back the Silmaril that Beren and Luthien brought back from Morgoth and handed them over to the elves there. In Doriath lived the Sindar, including Teleri and also Nandor elves, so they were not the biggest fans of the Noldor after this, with for sure some exceptions like Galadriel, who was also taught by Queen Melian. Of course, later they tried to forgive the Noldor and to live in peace again. Overall, the story is a bit more complicated though. Thousands of years later, with Gil-galad being the High King of the Noldor, leading the elves of the Last Alliance, the Sylvan elves did not want to be under his command. As said, it's still a bit more complicated. So under the command of Amdir, King of Lorien, and Orofer, King of the Sylvan elves of Mirkwood, and Thranduil's father, they charged the enemy before Gil-galad gave the signal, and suffered heavy casualties because of that. Orofer died and Amdir and his troops were pushed back to the Dead Marshes and perished there. The remaining Sylvan elves were then led by Thranduil, Orofer's son. With this, Sauron could inflict heavy casualties that were otherwise unnecessary, but in the end it did not stop the Last Alliance. They now fought their way through Mordor and laid siege on Barad-dûr for 7 years. Anarion was killed during this siege. Then, finally, Sauron himself came out of his fortress and fought Gil-galad and Elendil at once in front of Mount Doom. He killed Gil-galad and Elendil, breaking his sword Narthil as he fell, but Sauron was also thrown down, which allowed Isildur to cut off his finger with the One Ring using the hilt shard of Narthil. Sauron was vanquished but not dead, and his spirit escaped, hiding and regaining power for a very long time. Círdan and Elrond advised Isildur to destroy the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom, but he could not do it and claimed the ring as heirloom and tribute for his father's and brother's deaths. It has already started to influence Isildur. Also, Gondor got Minas Ithil back, built strongholds and guarded Mordor, so they had an eye on what was going on there. With this, the Third Age began. You could say Sauron should get his revenge on Isildur, who planted the white tree sapling in Minas Anor in memory of his brother Anarion, and made a grave for his father. He also granted the rule over Gondor to Anarion's son Mineldil, while he took the rule of Arnor in the north. He and his 3 sons now made their way back to Arnor, but wanted to visit Rivendell first, so they rode north along the Anduin. Isildur's wife and his 4th son would probably be waiting there. But in the Gladden Fields, a large host of orcs ambushed them. Isildur and his allies were outnumbered. His sons died one by one. His squire managed to save the shards of Narsil and was only one of 3 survivors. Isildur used the One Ring to hide and swam through the river Anduin, but the ring slipped from his finger and so he got shot by orc arrows when he reached the other side of the river. Luckily, the ring was never found by Sauron's forces and lost for a very long time. In the Far East, the wild men were released from Sauron's tyranny, but the evil he put into them was still there, which led to chaos and wars they fought against each other. Some would need to flee further into the west, which will lead to many problems and conflicts in the future. Check my History of Rohan video, it is full of conflicts with Easterlings. This is also an interesting topic. It's quite complicated, but Morgoth and Sauron always had a lot of influence and power over the men of the East and South. The Easterlings, Haradrim, and later the people of Khand and the Dunelandings, like the Oathbreakers, who once even worshipped Morgoth and Sauron. This also includes Umbar through some Black Númenóreans. They built their influence during the First and Second Age and were almost always able to have it as a resource. One reason could be that the Númenóreans, with the foundation of settlements and later in exile the foundation of the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, drove those people out of their regions, and so they looked upon them as their natural enemies. Sauron, who was fighting Gondor, probably used this, and also men were very easy for him to corrupt. In addition, it must be noted that the Valar let the men of the East and South, but even the North, pretty much alone with their old friend Melkor and his servants, and only cared for their beloved elves. Eärendil had to sail to Valinor, risking his life, because men are not even allowed to enter Aman, and beg for help, which in the end established a good relationship of the Dunedain, the Westmen, to the Valar and elves. It also led to the foundation of Númenor, but all other tribes or groups of men on Ardar had little to no contact with the Valar, and far in the south and east probably people only knew Morgoth and Sauron, which is a reason why those allied with them. In this context, it is quite interesting that the view of good and evil in Lord of the Rings gets at least a bit more detail and some shades of grey to it. This is also reflected in Lord of the Rings when Sam sees a dead warrior from Harad who fell to his feet, and he asks himself who he was and if he's actually evil or just a soldier fighting for a different cause. As mentioned, we are at the beginning of the Third Age. A lot of what happens during this time you can find in my other lore videos, so I try to not repeat myself too much, but of course I will go through all important events until The Hobbit begins. During the Third Age, Sauron goes back to his strategy of doing things in secret. His servants, and especially the Witch King of Angmar, play a big role during this age. I would even say that secrets play a very big role during this age in general. The theme of old tales and things that were long forgotten but become important again is very present during this age. With Sauron's loss of the One Ring, things become more peaceful at first, but just the event of, for example, Isildur's death is just a foreshadowing of big problems coming towards the kingdoms of men. Just think about that 3000 years later, Aragorn II is probably the last heir of Isildur. There is simply no one left. One interesting thing that Sauron did during this age was trying to get back the Rings of Power from the Dwarves. It is not known when he retrieved them, except for one, but he managed to get back 2 and later 3. 4 were lost or destroyed during incidents with dwarves and dragons. I later explain how he got the other ring back. Also, the kingdom of Arnor was divided into 3 smaller kingdoms: Arthedain, Cardolan and Rhudaur. During the first 1000 years, only the mentioned Easterlings threatened Gondor or its borders. They often got defeated, but also managed to kill King Romendakil I, who fought very successful in the east, but died in battle at some point in North Ithilien. His son Turambar succeeded him, destroyed the invaders and even conquered territories in Rhûn for Gondor. Another interesting place is Umbar in the south. Númenor back in the Second Age discovered this haven and often used it to land on Middle-earth, spreading their influence into the south and obtaining treasures and wealth from there. When Númenor came to its end, there were 2 groups: the mentioned faithful and, in contrast, the Kingsmen, who followed the king, who rebelled against the Valar and elves. Some of those Númenóreans, the Kingsmen, dwelt, for example, in Umbar, maybe because it was very far away from the realms of the elves, and they despised the elves and their elf friends, the faithful. They even worshipped Sauron. So after the destruction of Numenor, those who lived in Umbar and the south at this time obviously survived and were still there with the same ideas and attitude as it was common in Numenor at its end. So they had influence in this region and even continued to serve Sauron, which explains why Umbar gave Gondor a lot of trouble during the Third Age. As mentioned, those surviving Kingsmen were called Black Numenorians. As an interesting side note, one king took a Black Numenorian as wife, Queen Beruthiel, who used cats to spy on other Gondorian lords and people. She was not famous but well known. Aragorn references her in Moria 2000 years later in The Lord of the Rings. Gondor at one point managed to conquer Umbar, and the Black Numenorians fled into the south, fighting together with Harad and tried to recapture the city. Even though they managed to kill a king during the siege, they were for now not able to recapture it, and were even defeated at one of Gondor's peaks of power. I mentioned that the Valar had forsaken men. This changed with the arrival of the 5 Istari, Saruman, Radagast, Gandalf and the 2 Blue Wizards. They took the form of old men and arrived around this time too. Gandalf received the elven ring of power Narya from Círdan, who recognized his divine nature when landed in Mithlond. He was probably the only one who knew, because the Istari explored Middle-earth and its situation in secret for a very long time, never openly showing who they were. The 2 Blue Wizards went to the Far East. Also around this time, Sauron entered Greenwood the Great, dwelling in Dol Guldur, slowly corrupting parts of it, which changed the name to Mirkwood. Maybe Shelob's offspring, the Mirkwood spiders, arrived at this time too. With this, calamity slowly came over Middle-earth and Gondor. The evil forces were again more directly at work, but still in secret. The Easterlings also became more active again. For this, Gondor tried to ally with the Norsemen of Rovanion and fought together against the Easterlings, which expanded Gondor's power even further, as explained in the History of Rohan video. The Norsemen were like a buffer against the Easterlings for the northern regions of Gondor, but this came at a price. King Romendakil II sent his son Valakar to Rovanion as an ambassador. He fell in love with the people there and with Vidumavi, the daughter of the king of Rovanion, and married her. They also had a son with the Gothic name Vinitaria, who later got the Quenya name Eldakar when he came to Gondor with his family. For the proud Gondorian nobles, it was a scandal that the heir of the throne mixed with non-Numenorian and Dunedain blood. One fear was that this could diminish his and his descendants' lifespan. It turned out that this was not the case later. But when Eldakar became king, this led to a civil war, the so-called Kinstrife. His distant cousin Castamir, who had ships and power in Umbar and Pelargir, led the rebellion against Eldakar. In a brutal civil war, Castamir destroyed Osgiliath, where its Palantir got lost. Eldakar escaped, but his first son was captured and executed. Eldakar fled north, and Castamir ruled over Gondor, but his brutality and actions as king made him very unpopular. In the north, Eldakar rallied an army of Norsemen and even Dunedain. Also people from the northern Gondorian regions, Anórien, Ithilien and Carlenadthon, who were against Castamir, followed him. In the Battle of the Crossings of Erui, Eldakar slew Castamir, revenged his son and was victorious. Castamir's sons and followers escaped over the sea to Umbar and became known as the Corsairs of Umbar. The city should be under their control and become a place for all foes of Gondor until the end of the Third Age, even allying with Sauron. Even though this victory ended the Kinstrife Third Age 1447, it has caused a lot of chaos in Gondor, and many High Lords had died in battles, which weakened the realm. In addition, Umbar should ally with Harad and trouble them in the next 200 years. Even though they managed to defend against the south, it was weakened further, and so Gondor started to neglect watching over Mordor. You see where this is going. When around 3rd Age 1635 the Great Plague was spreading over the kingdoms of men, killing the population so heavily that Osgiliath was deserted and fell to ruin, Gondor abandoned watching over Mordor completely. Even though it is never stated that Sauron was behind all of this, it is not far-fetched to assume that he had at least something to do with it. With Mordor not guarded anymore and the Great Plague spreading to Eriador and with this to Arnor, Sauron had suddenly more options at hand. But we also have to take a look at Sauron's and his servants' activities in the north. As mentioned, Arnor was divided into 3 kingdoms, Arthedain, Cardolan and Rhudaur, which weakened it, and around the 3rd Age 1300 the kingdom of Angmar was founded by the lord of the Nazgul, who became known as the Witch King of Angmar. This guy was just a constant threat and started wars in this region. The Witch King attacked Arthedain, which continued the bloodline of Isildur, and he conquered Rhudaur, where he installed an Easterling king. The kingdom of Arthedain, together with Cardolan, were able to defend against the attacks. Also, Lindon and Rivendell helped out. The latter was even under siege. These wars went for several hundred years and Cardolan was in big trouble. When then, in addition, the Great Plague arrived there too, Cardolan was deserted and no one was left. The Witch King also sent evil spirits, the Barrow-wights, maybe Fal Mayar, to the Barrow Downs, the capital of Cardolan, to haunt that place so that the kingdom would also stay deserted in the future. But Angmar continued to attack the remaining kingdoms, so Arthedain counseled with Gondor, and both understood that with combined forces they could put an end to this, which would help both kingdoms. As a result, there was the marriage between a daughter of the reigning line of Gondor named Firiel and the Arthedain prince Arvedui, both ancestors of Aragorn. But in the end, it did not turn out well. Gondor had enough problems on its own, so they could not send any help, and Arthedain slowly lost the war against Angmar. Switching back to Gondor, the Norsemen and Gondor were plagued by a special group of Easterlings called the Rain Riders, probably from the area around Rhûn. They used chariots in battle. These Easterlings even coordinated attacks with Harad and Khand. They were once enemies of the Easterlings, but allied against their common foe Gondor and attacked them from 2 sides, so Gondor had to split their armies. While the Southern army under Eärnil II was successful, the war against the Rain Riders in the north ended disastrous and the king and all his heirs got killed, so Gondor had temporarily no king. As said, Gondor had enough problems on its own. Arvedui and Firiel in Arthedain tried to claim the throne of Gondor, but the claim got refused and the victorious Eärnil II, who managed to surprise the already celebrating Rain Riders in the north and destroyed them too, became the new king. He was also of Isildur's bloodline. Eärnil II sent his son Eärnur with an army to help against Angmar, but he was too late and Arthedain got destroyed, even though the bloodline of kings survived, but there was nothing left to reign over. Eärnur united with the forces of Lindon under Círdan and managed to defeat Angmar completely, while the Witch King escaped, mocking Eärnur. Here, Glorfindel, who was sent to Middle-earth by the Valar, like the Istari, made the prophecy to Eärnur that he should not pursue the Witch King, and not by the hand of men shall he fall. The Witch King returned to Mordor, but was not done yet, and so he started an assault on Minas Ithil. After so many wars, Gondor was weak and could not reclaim the city, which from now on became known as Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery, and became the residence of the Witch King. This was 3rd Age 2002. Also, Minas Anor was renamed to Minas Tirith. Minas Ithil had one of the few remaining Palantir, and that's how Sauron got one of them. The other were in Isengard or Isengard and Minas Tirith, but the latter was only known to the kings and later the reigning stewards, I guess. But the Witch King still wasn't done. He challenged Eärnur to single combat. On advice of his steward, he refused, but the Witch King knew he would get him. So he renewed his challenge years later, and this time Eärnur accepted and rode to Minas Morgul. He was never seen again. In addition, he had no heir, and so Gondor no king. The Witch King chose a good point in time, because there was no ideal successor that would maybe not bring Gondor to another kinstrife, and so the era of Gondor's ruling Stewards began. In the background, many other things happened. In the north, the Eotheod moved further to the north, which had the side effect that Gondor became more vulnerable to attacks from the east, with the Eotheod not buffering against the Easterlings anymore. The dwarves in Moria awakened the Balrog, which would be known as Durin's Bane, and killed Durin the Sixth, which led to the dwarves leaving Moria, founding the kingdom under the mountain in Erebor, under Thrain the First. They later abandoned Erebor again and were busy defending their halls in the Grey Mountains against the dragons. Gandalf explored Dol Guldur to find out more about the necromancer, but the still weakened Sauron escaped to the east before Gandalf could identify him, probably strengthen his bond with the Easterlings even further. And with this, a time called the Watchful Peace begun. Also, without Sauron, things became a bit more peaceful, even though the Nazgul prepared for Sauron's return. Also, Uruk-hai were bred in Minas Morgul. With Sauron's return to Dol Guldur, 3rd Age 2460, the Watchful Peace ends. Around this time, many other events happen too. The White Council is formed and the One Ring is found by Deagol or Deagol and taken by Smeagol or Smeagol, who becomes Gollum. Sauron manages to conquer Osgiliath, which is abandoned by men for now, but later recaptured by Steward Boromir I. That is not the Boromir from The Lord of the Rings, but one of his ancestors. He later also sends orcs into the Misty Mountains and builds strongholds there. This includes Moria. Celebrian, Elrond's wife and daughter of Galadriel, on her way over the Misty Mountains is captured by orcs and later saved by her sons and leaves Middle-earth after this. In the north, Eorl becomes king and later helps Gondor, pretty much in the last minute, to defeat an invading group of Easterlings called Balchoth or Balkos, who were probably under the influence of Sauron. As explained in the History of Rohan video, this leads to the foundation of Rohan and the migration of many Norsemen to this region, with Eorl becoming the first king of Rohan, the Riddermark. The foundation and alliance with Rohan helps Gondor a lot, because they again buffer against the Easterlings and even the Dunelandings. The dwarves lost hold against the dragons in the Grey Mountains and retreated. Thror, the grandfather of Thorin II, that is Thorin Oakenshield, leads one part of the dwarves back to Erebor and establishes his kingdom there. His younger brother Gror, grandfather of Dain Ironfoot, leads the others to the Iron Mountains, where he establishes his kingdom. The next partially interesting thing is that Isengard is taken by Dunelandings. The Rohirrig lord with Dunelandish blood, Freka, who had influence over Duneland, was killed by Helm, which the Dunelandings should never forget. His son Wulf, who was more a lord of the Dunelandings, should revenge his father and successfully conquered Rohan, sitting on the throne in Meduseld. You can assume that Sauron had something to do with this, because Umbar attacked Gondor at the same time, so they could not send help, and Wulf was also joined by Gondorian foes, maybe also Corvairs of Umbar and Easterlings. Thanks to Helm Hammerhand the Hornburg or Hornburg, which got its name while besieged at this time during the long winter, Rohan survived but had great casualties. His son Frealaf managed to kill Wulf, drive the Dunelandings out and retake Rohan and free Isengard. After this, Saruman returned from a longer journey into the east and asked if he could have Isengard and offered to guard it and the Gap of Rohan. Frealaf accepted and recommended this solution to Gondor, and that's how Saruman got to live in Isengard, where he found the Palantir. Also, orcs started to trouble Eriador. Another interesting event that helped Sauron was the sack of Erebor, that was also around this time. So Smaug or Smaug drove the dwarves out of there and destroyed Dale, which led to other events. Gandalf was concerned that Sauron allies with Smaug or Smaug, and that's also why he later helped the dwarves to recapture Erebor. When the dwarves were in exile, Thror gave his Ring of Power along with the map and key to the Lonely Mountain to his son Thrain II and went to Moria, where he got killed by the orcs, probably by Arthog. Thror's dead body was thrown down the steps of Moria's east gate to his companion's feet, whose name was Nar, and was waiting for the exiled king to return. They threw a purse of coins to him, calling him a beggar. On Thror's severed head, he could read Arthog in Dwarvish runes. Nar escaped and reported to Thror's son Thrain II, who declared war and called all 7 houses of the dwarves to revenge his father's death, and so the war of the dwarves and orcs began. In the end, after 6 years, they killed many orcs and even Arthog in front of the east gate of Moria, where also Thorin II earned his name Oakenshield. During the final battle, a very young Dain II, that's Dain Ironfoot, killed Arthog. Thrain took the orc leader's severed head, shoved the perch into his mouth and put it on a pole, revenging his father. Even though it was discussed to retake Moria, the majority of dwarf lords decided against it because revenge was done under heavy losses and Durin's Bane was still dwelling in Moria. Although dwarves had heavy casualties, this was a loss of power for Sauron too, because the Misty Mountains were almost cleansed of orcs. Many remaining orcs fled over Rohan to the White Mountains in the south, troubling the Riddermark, but bringing more peace to Eriador. The later battle of the 5 armies we know from The Hobbit decimated the orcs even further, but also the dwarves. After the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, the homeless Thrain II and Thorin Oakenshield went west with their people to the Blue Mountains. But Sauron should get his revenge. The Ring of Power increased the desire for treasure in Thrain II, and so he went on an expedition to the Lonely Mountain with the brothers Dvalin and Balin. They got constantly attacked by orcs and wargs, and at some day Thrain II was captured by Sauron's forces and brought to Dol Guldur and tormented. With this, Sauron got the last Ring of Power of the dwarves back and left him in his dungeons to die. Gandalf searched for him, even in Moria, but couldn't find him. After that, he again visited Dol Guldur and found Thrain II by accident, who was near death and didn't even know who he was anymore. He learned that the necromancer is indeed Sauron and not a Nazgul, and that he has Thrain's Ring of Power. He also got the map and key to Erebor from Thrain, who died in Dol Guldur. Gandalf probably realized after that the dwarf he met was Thrain. Different than seen in the Hobbit movies, Gandalf escaped and reported to the White Council, but Saruman vetoed against an attack and suggested to observe and wait, to which the council agreed. Gandalf was not realizing that Saruman wanted the One Ring for himself and in secret searched for it. Even though he didn't find it, he would find the Star of Elendil, the sign of the King of Arnor, lost by Isildur in the Anduin, when he died. Much later, Gandalf visited Thorin Oakenshield and discussed the quest for Erebor, and the White Council consisting of Saruman, Galadriel, Gandalf, Elrond and Círdan agreed to attack Dol Guldur to confront Sauron, but Sauron escaped and fled to Mordor. In the background, Saruman, who was also a Maya of Aule like Sauron once, started using the Palantir and getting corrupted by Sauron, but this was even after The Hobbit. An interesting note is that Denethor II studied the history of the Palantiri too and started to use the one in Minas Tirith, even confronting Sauron. He was not corrupted, but it burdened him heavily. And all of this led to the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. When he was finally back in Mordor, he already was able to take physical form again. The depiction from the movies as a big fiery eye can't be found in the books, but of course the lidless eye is the symbol of Sauron and can be found on equipment of his orcs. I have to admit, while doing research, I was amazed by how much work Sauron did over the course of more than 6,500 years. Sauron was always there and Morgoth's most trusted servant. As you can see, Sauron was a master of manipulating people, and he could do both, fight giant wars and destroy powerful kingdoms from within. Also, his servants like the Witch King did a lot of work too. What a cruel entity. But Sauron didn't want to destroy Middle-earth, but bring some kind of order to it and rule over it, dominating all weaker minds and prepare the world for his master's return, at any cost. He loved order, even though his vision seems twisted, because he would use anything, no matter how cruel it was. It is also interesting to see how often he was incredibly close to conquering Middle-earth, but also that the Valar, you could say, almost abandoned a big part of mankind, considering how the people of the East and South were influenced by Melkor and his servants. Since men awoke, it is understandable that they allied with him. The help and blessings of the Valar were only granted to the Dún Edain, whose great hero Eärendil had to beg for it, risking his life. The rest had to fight alone or join Morgoth. The second time the Valar helped men in a big way was in the Third Age by sending the Istari about 4,000 years later. This neglection for sure explains Morgoth and Sauron's influence over the men of the East and South. I think it also adds a little layer of grey to the story. Sam, for example, later sees a dead Harad warrior and asks himself who he was, if he was really evil, and what his motivations were to come here and fight. It should also be noted how the foundation of the Dún Edain kingdoms in exile, Arnor and Gondor, drove away the people who were there first, and Dunlandings, Easterlings and Haradrim had definitely reasons to despise the Westmen. I hope with all of this you understand Sauron a bit better. The Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales and the Lord of the Rings Appendices made him a bit more like a character, even though he still has not much character development potential, since he is fully devoted to Morgoth and chose a path from which he can never return. Only his approaches developed over the ages, from the traitor learning dark secrets from Morgoth, to the new Dark Lord wielding big armies, to evil entity in the background manipulating the fate of Middle-earth to his favor, regaining his power. Thank you for watching. At the end, some small notes. This should be my longest video so far and probably ever, at least when it comes to strongly edited content like this. I really try to compress a lot of it and even cut out pages of text, so there are probably some mistakes and sometimes I'm a bit imprecise, but overall this should be a very detailed look at Sauron and the development of Arda around him. I was really surprised myself how much there is about Sauron and Morgoth. I thought this would be much shorter, and this is also the reason why it took pretty much 3 times as long as originally planned. I also decided against splitting this video into 2 parts, which was probably a stupid idea. I also recommend watching my other lore videos, especially the one about Aragorn and Númenor and maybe the history of Rohan, because there are parts that are explained in more detail there. I hope you enjoyed this video. Consider the YouTube and Twitter things. Thank you for watching again and goodbye.